It started, as most things do, quietly. There were no warnings, no sudden alarms, no reason for anyone to suspect that something terrible was happening. Life moved forward as it always had: school, church, family gatherings, faces that smiled in passing, conversations that never went too deep. No one ever thought to ask. No one ever thought to look closer. But behind one door, in a house like any other, was a child who carried a secret too heavy for her to hold. A girl who learned, far too young, that fear could become routine, that silence could be a survival tool, that the person meant to protect her was the very one who made her feel the most alone. At just 12 years old, Marie Murphy's world was no longer her own. She didn't wake up each morning with the same thoughts as other children. She didn't worry about school assignments or daydream about weekend adventures. Her days were measured differently. In footsteps approaching, in the sound of a door closing, in the weight of knowing that what happened in the dark could never be spoken of in the light. She was just a child forced to live in a world where innocence did not exist. A child who had no choice but to obey, because disobedience meant pain. A child who learned to smile when she needed to, who learned to keep her voice steady, who learned to carry a lie so well that even those closest to her never saw the truth. This was not a single night of fear. This was not a moment of weakness or an accident or a mistake. This was a life sentence handed down to a child, carried out every single day for more than a decade. The hands that should have held her safely became the hands that took everything from her. And yet, the world outside remained unchanged. Years passed. The town continued as it always had. No one suspected a thing. And why would they? There was no sign, no evidence, no loud cries for help. Only a girl who grew older. A girl who learned how to survive. A girl who believed that this was simply the way things were. But silence does not last forever. And when the truth finally came out, it sent shockwaves through an entire community. The man they thought they knew, the father, the neighbor, the familiar presence in town, was exposed for who he truly was. Anne-Marie, the girl who was once powerless, stood in a courtroom decades later, no longer a child, no longer afraid, and told the world exactly what had been stolen from her. How does someone survive something like this? How does a child endure years of pain and emerge strong enough to speak? And when justice finally arrives, is it ever enough? This is her story. Welcome to True Crime Files, where we bring you the most gripping stories of crime, survival, and justice. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. She was just 12 years old when it began. Too young to understand what was happening. Too afraid to tell anyone. Too trapped to escape. The days that followed were the start of something no child should ever endure. A reality that stretched from one moment to the next, from one year into another, until time itself no longer held meaning. Until survival was the only thing that mattered. Marie Murphy's world was small, but the fear was everywhere. It was in the way she moved, in the way she held her breath when she heard footsteps. It was in the way she learned to stay silent, to obey, to disappear inside herself when there was nowhere else to go. Her home should have been a place of warmth, a place where she could sleep without fear, where she could laugh without consequence. But inside those walls, she was not a daughter. She was not a child. She was something else, something that did not belong to herself. Her father, Edward Molyneaux, was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He was not reckless. He was not careless. He made sure there were no witnesses. He made sure she knew that no one would believe her. He made sure she understood that if she ever spoke, the consequences would be worse than anything she had already suffered. He took his time. He took everything. It did not happen in one place. It did not happen in the shadows of a single room. It followed her everywhere, out into the open air, into the fields where no one could hear her, onto the roads that stretched far from home, into places so familiar, yet forever changed by what was done to her there. The world around her remained the same, but she did not. The girl she had been before was gone. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years, and the years stretched on, each one marked by the same unrelenting horror. She grew older, but the fear did not fade. It stayed with her, shaping the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she saw herself. She was no longer living, only surviving. She knew there was no escape, not as long as she was under his control, not as long as she had no one to turn to. She carried the weight of her silence, her secret, her shame, though none of it had ever been hers to bear. And all the while, the man responsible walked freely among others, living his life as if nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had. To him, she was nothing more than a thing to use and discard. This was not a single act of violence. This was a routine, a pattern, a carefully maintained reality designed to ensure that she never fought back, never spoke out, never broke free. He had built a prison around her, and the walls were too high, too strong, too impossible to climb. But the thing about walls is that, over time, they weaken, even the strongest ones. And all it takes is a single moment, a single choice, a single breath of courage to make the first crack. And once that crack appears, nothing can stop the truth from breaking through. The day had finally come. After years of silence, years of suffering, years of carrying a truth too heavy to bear alone, Marie Murphy stepped into the courtroom. She was no longer a child. She was no longer powerless. She had spent her life trapped in his control. But now, for the first time, the power was shifting. The truth that had been buried for decades was about to be laid bare for the world to hear. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read. One after another, the list seemed endless. 61 counts of rape, 3 counts of indecent assault, 2 charges of physical harm. Each number represented a moment of pain, a night stolen, a wound that never truly healed. Each count was a reminder of how long this had gone on, how many times she had been forced to endure it. And yet, even as the weight of his crimes filled the room, the man responsible sat there unmoved. Edward Molyneaux did not break down. He did not apologize. He did not show even the smallest trace of guilt. Instead, when he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through everyone who heard them. "I am a pedophile," he admitted. And then with a shrug he added, "But it was just my daughter. Just my daughter." A sentence so cruel, so devoid of remorse, that even the most hardened in the courtroom struggled to process what they had just heard. There was no shame in his voice, no regret, only the cold, matter-of-fact tone of a man who had long believed that what he had done was his right. His words hung in the air like a weight. Marie, sitting just feet away, listened as the man who had stolen her childhood reduced her pain to nothing, as if the years of suffering meant nothing, as if she, herself, meant nothing. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the testimonies, the statements, the overwhelming proof of what had been done to her. And yet, Molyneaux sat there, dismissive, unshaken. He spoke about what he had done as if it were something trivial. He described it as sex games, as if the torture of a child, his own child, was nothing more than a game to him, as if the suffering he inflicted had been something insignificant, something forgettable. But Marie had not forgotten. She had spent every day of her life carrying what he had done to her. And now, she made sure the court saw it for what it was. The judge listened. The jury listened. And for the first time, the world heard the truth. When the verdict was read, the silence in the room shifted. Guilty. On every single count. There was no question, no doubt, no room for escape. The man who had spent decades hiding behind the illusion of a normal life, the man who had convinced himself that he would never be held accountable, was finally facing the truth. 15 years. That was the sentence. For some, it did not seem long enough. For others, it was a small victory. But for Marie, it was a confirmation of what she had always known. What had been done to her was real. It was wrong. And no matter how many years had passed, no matter how much time had been lost, her voice had been heard. As the court emptied, as Molyneaux was led away in handcuffs, Marie walked out of that building no longer carrying his secret. It was no longer hers to hold. The man who had stolen her childhood would live out his final days behind bars. And for the first time in her life, she was free. For most of her life, Marie Murphy lived in silence. The years of pain, the memories she could never erase, the weight of what had been done to her, it all remained locked inside. She had carried it alone, believing that speaking out would only bring more suffering, that no one would listen, that no one would believe her. But when the moment finally came, when she had the chance to stand before the world and tell her story, she did not hesitate. She could have remained anonymous. She could have let the court documents and the trial record speak for her. But Marie made a different choice. She refused to be hidden. She refused to be reduced to a nameless victim in a case file. She wanted the world to know her name, to hear her voice, to understand what she had survived. She wanted to take back what had been stolen from her, not just her childhood, but her right to be seen, to be heard, to exist without shame. Standing in that courtroom, she faced a man who had controlled her for more than a decade. He had spent years convincing her that she was powerless, that she was nothing, that no one would ever believe her. And yet, here she was, speaking words he could no longer silence. "He thought he broke me," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "But I rebuilt myself stronger." Her statement was not just a recounting of what he had done. It was a declaration, a refusal to be defined by the past, a message to anyone who had ever suffered in silence, who had ever been told that their pain did not matter. She had endured the worst, and yet she had built a life beyond it, a life where she was no longer trapped, no longer afraid. The court listened, the judge listened, and when it was time to hand down the sentence, there was no doubt about the severity of his crimes. Ms. Justice Siobhan Langford did not soften her words. She called his actions what they were, beyond cruelty, beyond comprehension. She described them as the highest level of degradation, an unrelenting, calculated destruction of a child's innocence. And then, the sentence was delivered. 15 years. It was not enough to erase the past. It was not enough to undo what had been done, but it was enough to ensure that he would never hurt her again. At 82 years old, Edward Molyneaux would likely never walk free again. The walls that had once kept Marie trapped now held him instead. As the courtroom emptied, as people filed out and the weight of the trial finally began to settle, Marie Murphy walked forward. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. She had spent years living in the shadows of what he had done to her. But now, the truth was no longer hers to carry alone. It had been spoken, it had been heard, and at long last, justice had been served. Marie Murphy's story is one that should never have had to be told. No child should have to endure what she did. No person should have to carry that weight alone. And yet, for years, she did. She lived through the unimaginable, through pain no one could see, through suffering that left no visible scars but cut deeper than anything that could be measured. She was a child when it began, but she was a woman when she stood in that courtroom and spoke the truth. And in doing so, she reclaimed the voice that had been taken from her. She did not let what happened define her. She built a life beyond it. She took what was meant to break her and used it to help others. As a mental health nurse, she has spent years supporting those in need, giving them the care and understanding she was denied for so long. She knows what it means to feel helpless. She knows what it means to believe that no one will listen, and that is why she chose to speak. To prove that silence does not have to be forever, that survival is possible, that justice, even when it comes late, can still matter. The case is closed. The sentence has been handed down. Edward Molyneaux will spend the rest of his days behind bars. But there are others, too many others, who have yet to face the consequences of their actions. For every Marie Murphy who steps forward, there are countless more who remain unheard. And that is why this story matters. Not just for the justice it delivered, but for the message it sends to those still suffering in silence. If you or someone you know is living with the pain of abuse, know that you are not alone. There are people who will listen. There are people who will believe you. There are people who will fight for justice alongside you. No one should have to carry this burden alone. Help is out there. Support is out there. And if Marie's story has shown anything, it is that speaking out can be the first step toward freedom. Justice was served in this case. But the question remains, how much more can be done? How many others are still waiting for their day in court, for their chance to be heard, for the world to recognize what they have endured? How do we, as a society, do more to protect those who are vulnerable, to make sure that no child is forced to live in fear, that no survivor is left without support? The conversation does not end here. It cannot end here. What do you think should be done? What does true justice look like? Let us know. This is just one case, one story, but there are many more. If you want to hear them, if you want to know the truth behind some of the most shocking and heartbreaking crimes, stay with us. There is so much more to uncover, and there are so many voices that still need to be heard. Subscribe for more stories that deserve to be told.